Change is always difficult. There's always friction with change, no matter what you're doing.
Welcome to this week's As Unexpected podcast, when we talk to C-suite executives, entrepreneurs, and philanthropists about how they lead into the future when the future generally goes as unexpected. I'm Scott Marshall, your host, and my own professional experience has made me a believer that it's not how you show up when all goes as planned, but it is how you show up when things go as unplanned. Given all of their experiences, each of our guests has become very attuned to the fact that the future is not to be predicted. My hope is that this podcast can help all of you become better leaders by building the core leadership capabilities for leading in an uncertain world. Hey, welcome everybody to another episode of As Unexpected. I have today an amazing guest who has risen up into a very important position in the U.S., really in service to our democracy. And this time of year and this cycle, and this 4-year cycle, I think it's very apropos that we bring him on. I have a lot to learn from this guest, and I think everybody will just appreciate the work he does, the work his organization does, and the commitment he has to some of our founding principles and just the belief in the principles of democracy. Ben Hovland, welcome to As Unexpected.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to join you.
Would you mind starting off by giving our audience some background on your career and then some understanding of your current role in the commission itself?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's sort of a long, winding route in some ways, but where I'll pick it up was after law school, I went to work at the Missouri Secretary of State's office. And as will come up probably a lot in this conversation, in the United States, our elections are run at the state and local level, primarily the local level. But it was in that role that sort of, I guess, the bug, if you will, of election administration bit me, thinking about how we can serve Americans who want to participate in the process. And so that's really where I started in election administration. I then held a few different roles. I worked at a nonprofit, then I worked at the U.S. Senate Committee on Rules and Administration, which is a mouthful, but just at the U.S. Senate for 5.5 years, working on issues around election administration and money in politics. And then probably from that role, I was appointed to this commission. So the U.S. Election Assistance Commission is a small federal agency. A lot of people have not heard of us. You become aware of that when you go out and talk to folks. But what people probably have heard of is the reason that we got created, and that was really the Florida 2000 election. And so after Florida 2000, Congress passed legislation called the Help America Vote Act of 2002. And it did a number of things, but one of those was it created the Election Assistance Commission. And it created us to be what I call a customer service agency. We are a largely non-regulatory agency. It means we can't really tell people what to do. But again, because our elections are run at the state and local level, and each state runs elections a little bit differently, it was creating a federal body to again provide assistance. Both in grant money. The Congress provides grant money that we distribute. We also test and certify voting equipment. That's become more popular in recent years. We conduct something called the Election Administration and Voting Survey, which is the only national survey of its kind that looks across the country at how Americans are participating in the process, like how they're getting registered. Is that at their motor vehicle agency? Is that online? Is that with a third-party registration group? And then how they're casting their ballot. Is that by mail? Is that early in person? Or is that on election day? And that really gives us a snapshot look at how Americans are participating in the process and allows policymakers to make data-driven decisions. And then finally, the last function is called, it's a clearinghouse function, which doesn't always make a lot of sense to folks. But essentially, again, it's recognizing that each state runs elections a little differently and looking out across those states and sharing those best practices so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel, so we can find efficiencies so that voters can be served better all across the country.
That is super helpful. There's a number of things that come up from what you said. First of all, my faint memory of 2000 is Dade County and hanging chads. Is that all part of that history?
That is exactly right. And so again, historically, election administration wasn't something that people paid a lot of attention to, or they don't until they do, if you will. And
Right.
so hanging chads, the butterfly ballot, if you remember that, those were all election administration issues. And again, ones that Congress tried to tackle with the Help America Vote Act. And again, we've obviously seen some issues in recent years, or at least concerns. And so again, a big part of our role is working with those state and local officials, helping them, as they serve their voters, looking at ways to communicate about the process. For so many Americans, historically, it was like, oh, maybe I tune in, I go vote, I tune in on election night, I find out, who won, hopefully, and that was the end of it. And in the last few years, we've seen a lot more interest in the process. And so it's helping people to, refine those processes, but also to do a better job talking about them. I think one of the things that I've really realized or begun to recognize is, I guess I've bored enough people at like holiday dinners historically, or watched people tune out to know that they weren't necessarily, again, historically interested in the nitty gritty. And so I think election officials talked within their own community, used a lot of jargon, talked about the differences. And there's some work to do to get better at talking to other people now that other people want to hear about it. And so, again, breaking down some of those barriers, making it accessible, and helping people to understand the safeguards that are in place, the reasons that they can have confidence in the process, all of the work really that goes into ensuring the accuracy and integrity of our elections, which is a great part of my job. I get to travel around the country and see that all over in jurisdictions all over the country.
It sounds like a very small but mighty commission in terms of what it's trying to accomplish, for sure. And I can tell you, I'm certainly very interested in this topic. The idea that every American should have access to a ballot and the ability to vote just seems profoundly important. So just kudos to you. Just to clarify, as I understand, your position as commissioner is as a Senate appointed position. Is that right? Or confirmed position?
That is correct. So we're an independent bipartisan agency. We have 4 commissioners. I'm one of those.
Okay.
And then we rotate in our role. And so I am currently the chair. I don't know if that's the short straw or the long straw, but it's the one I drew. Again, certainly always is interesting in a presidential election year. And again, this year has been no different.
Yeah, well, and thank you for the sign behind you. For those who are just listeners and not watching on YouTube, the sign behind Ben says, "This time, vote like your whole world depends on it." So I'm just reiterating that, making sure our listeners are aware of his commitment and, of course, my commitment to making sure that everybody just takes time to get out and vote. None of us are on this podcast telling people how to vote. We're just telling people to vote. It's a right of American citizen. So exercise that right. So Ben, obviously the title of this podcast is As Unexpected. In my role with this institute and our program, boy, we face unexpected stuff quite often. The unexpected is expected. We just don't know what it is because it's unexpected by nature, right? And my guess is in your career and in your current position, there are many times when you faced and continue to face things that are unexpected. I'd love for you to share your own narratives, your own stories about this, and how you showed up. First of all, for yourself, because we got to show up for ourselves first, and then for those around you. I'm really interested in some of the stories you might be able to share. This episode of As Unexpected is sponsored in part by Semester at Sea, a study abroad program for college students and adults on career breaks, sabbaticals, or retired, interested in learning and exploring the world together. Learn more about the Lifelong Learner program at www.semesteratSea.org.
So I will say one thing about elections. Elections are certainly no different. There are always unexpected things in elections. And again, talking with state and local election officials, seeing things pop up around the country, so much work goes into contingency planning, continuity of operations planning. That is a thing that your local election officials do all over the country. We see everything from weather events, in the southeast, it might be a hurricane. In the west, it might be a fire. In the Midwest, it might be a tornado. All of those things have impacted elections. In my career, floods. It may just be a power outage. Who knows what it is? But that is absolutely a fundamental part of administering elections. That said, thinking about sort of a story to share. Obviously, a lot of people had an unexpected experience during the pandemic, but elections were no different. It was 2020. There was a presidential election coming. It was on the books. It was going to happen. That's the piece of election administration that is not unexpected. The election is happening. And so then the question is, how do you
We know the 4-year cycle, right? We know.
Exactly. And so in 2020, I remember, my own experience. Again, we travel a lot around the country as commissioners. I was actually in Mississippi for their presidential primary election. And I flew back on a flight with, I think, 7 people on a big, 747, which was a little surprising. And then, the next day or the day after, things really shut down. But for election officials around the country, it was immediately thinking about, how is this going to change the role of running elections? How are Americans going to want to engage? Of course, in every state, there's an options. It does depend a little, but everything in elections depends. But for the most part, people have the option to vote by mail, even in states that are not full vote by mail states. And so, of course, we were going to see a spike in that. That was expected. But also and ultimately we saw a record number of Americans vote by mail in 2020. We saw a record number of Americans vote early in person in 2020 as well. And then those election day numbers themselves were down a little bit, but again, with social distancing, and that was a good thing, and that was the message that we were trying to get out. But for so many offices, when you look at the vote by mail states, or the full vote by mail states where they have mail driven elections like Oregon or Washington, they had spent years, decades, ramping up to that, refining processes and procedures, adapting to that. And you had a lot of jurisdictions that might only have had maybe 5% mail, who were now going to be looking at 30 or 40% mail. And when you talk about the volume and the scale of that, are you doing, when you're 5%, you may be operating totally in a very manual environment. You may not have the equipment that the larger jurisdictions have, or the places that depend on mail. They have automated, scanners and slicers and envelope extractors and all of that type of equipment that you may not have in a jurisdiction when you don't have those volume needs. And so it was talking about that. It was making people aware of potential supply chain concerns. One of the things that I did right out of the gate was host a video chat with 3 election officials from Utah, Oregon, and California, or Utah, Washington, California, who had administered elections before they were in a vote by mail environment, when they had the traditional polling place environment, and then had been there through the transition, to just let them talk about what that transition was like, what those lessons learned were, what those recommendations they would have for their colleagues around the country. And it was a great conversation and just very useful to get people, I think, thinking about how, in this moment, they were going to focus on the task at hand and make those early decisions that would pay dividends down the road.
That's phenomenal how, of course, I've thought about the pandemic in so many different ways. You're probably aware that, in my organization, we were conducting a voyage, a semester sea voyage, and we had to end that voyage early. We had to ensure the safety of all those voyagers, get them back home. And so logistics and planning and all that was significant. But I had not parlayed that into thinking about the scaling up of vote by mail, the infrastructure, the equipment, training, even as you were saying, supply chain. I mean, like ballots. Did they have to reorder different ballots? Did they, so if you think beyond that, what was the longer term impact of all those changes in terms of are more states fully adopting vote by mail? Is the sophistication of the equipment that much better? What other sort of security concerns now, or safety concerns, or data concerns exist from that?
So a few things. I think that in 2020, almost 45% of Americans voted by mail. I think that'll be a high watermark for a little while, but we were already seeing sort of a trajectory up. And so when I've made predictions for this election, for the 2024 election, I think it'll be a lower percentage by mail than 2020, but way higher than 2016, higher than we've seen any year other than 2020. And part of that is, again, you have seen some states, they put procedures in place. They liked them. Their population liked them. They kept them. So that's a piece of it. But also one of the things that we've seen over time, as states or jurisdictions have expanded what are broadly convenience voting options, basically options to vote other than Tuesday.
Right.
People
Right.
people like them. Voters like them, and that makes sense. Tuesday. If we had a whole nother podcast, I could talk about. Tuesday was when we were an agrarian society. That was when that became election day. It's still a tradition. A lot of people like it, but for a lot of people, Tuesday is not the best day to interrupt. And so, whether it's by mail, whether it's early in person,
Right.
on the weekend or whatever, when people have those options, they embrace them. And so, for a number of Americans who maybe had never voted by mail or were less familiar with that process, they got exposed to it in 2020. Some liked it, some didn't. Some will go back to voting in person, but a number will keep voting by mail. And so again, for your prediction here, you will see more Americans vote by mail this year than any year other than 2020, I think.
Yeah, it's so interesting. My understanding is daylight saving is also a reflection of an agrarian society. So, maybe we should start to encourage a bill that changes that and encourages more voting besides Tuesday, for sure. And to your point, I'm pretty sure most people don't decide on that Tuesday who they're going to vote for. They probably had a good sense of it prior to that Tuesday. Maybe Sunday, maybe Saturday they finally reached the conclusion. But my guess is the majority of people have already decided.
I think you're generally right on that. And, one of the things that from the election administration side, which frankly, for a lot of people, that isn't necessarily something they think about or a distinction they make, but there's the campaigns and the politics side, and those folks, can talk about what they need to talk about. But election administration, is just how our elections are run. And again, that's at the local level. There's a professional in your local government who runs elections, and what their title is varies by state. It's often county clerks or maybe municipal clerks or recorders or auditors. It's boards of elections depending on, again, the state. But that person is a professional. they follow the law as set out by your state legislature, and they're transparent in the process. And so much of that, again, to me, when I think about what good election administration looks like, it's not about politics. It's about good governance and customer service. It's about serving those voters, making sure that Americans are able to make their voice heard, and that's a big deal on so many levels. But that's sort of the role of what your election administrator does. And then on the individual side, there's the things that you can do. And so, if you have made up your mind, or even before that, if you are still not sure, there's those pieces you can do, those steps you can take to get ready. Making sure you're registered to vote, making sure your registration is up to date, that it's at your current address, things like that. Life changes for people. People get married, they get divorced, they change their name, they move. Whatever those things are, those trigger a need to update your voter registration. But then it's finding out what your options are in your state. And you might have heard the phrase "making a plan to vote" or "being vote ready," and that's again knowing, oh, I really like voting by mail. I'm going to do that. When do I need to request a ballot if I need to in my state? When do I need to get that back in the mail to make sure it has plenty of time, that the post office has time to do their job? Or maybe I want to vote early in person or on election day, and where is the place that I go for that? And having thought through that makes sure that you as a voter can have a great experience on election day, but then also helps out your poll workers, helps out those people that
Right.
are your friends or neighbors that are in the polling place running the election, so that you don't have to fill out a change of address form there or have some issue that they have to call in and find out what to do about. So there's a way
Yeah.
to make a difference in the process for all of us.
Right on. Now, Ben, you've made a clear differentiation. I want to make sure our audience understands this differentiation between campaigns and politics and partisanship, and election administration around governance and customer service. And obviously, it's the latter where you're operating. Nonetheless, as we're all aware, anybody who's been paying attention, election administration has gotten a bit in the spotlight over the last 4 to 5, 6 years. And that's just sort of in the politics part of it, but kind of in the spotlight at times. So with that in mind, I'd like to read you a quote. Because of the spotlight that does shine a bit at times on election administration, I'd like to read you a quote and have you respond to it. The quote is from a book called Leadership on the Line by Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky. And it's very short. It goes like this. Taking the heat with grace communicates respect for the pains of change. Taking the heat with grace communicates respect for the pains of change.
I like that. And when I think about, anything, change is always difficult. There's always friction with change, no matter what you're doing. In the election administration world, you mentioned that attention. Again, more people are paying attention to the process. That has created confusion. That requires change in how we communicate about the process. And one of the things that I really think about and like that quote for, and this is often easier said than done, but having empathy and understanding that, I've heard from a number of voters, or I see voters who have these concerns, and while I may disagree with them, at the end of the day, uh, they're passionate about that because they care about our democracy, just as I do. And so it's having that understanding and saying, look, let me talk to you about this. Or have you been a poll worker? I've been a poll worker a number of times myself. It's an amazing experience. You get to be that customer service face of our democracy. You get to help those people, your neighbors, help them to participate and make their voice heard. But you also get to see a little bit behind the curtain at all the work that goes into running our elections. You don't get a very big glimpse as a voter. You show up, you take care of your business,
Right,
you get the
right.
sticker, and you leave. As a poll worker, you're working in bipartisan teams. you're checking off, there's chain of custody logs that you're filling out. You're making sure the serial numbers are all matched up. You're making sure all the voted and unvoted ballots all add up. And doing that gives people confidence because it gives people understanding. And they realize, oh, there's checks and balances all throughout this system. And it's a very deliberative process. It's a very labor intensive process. But again, it's having that understanding that often makes a big difference for people and gives them the confidence that so many election administrators have because they're very familiar with how this works.
Yeah. I want to really echo something that you said early in your comments, and that is we may not agree at one level, but fundamentally, the motivation is the same. And in this world of bipartisanship and divisive discourse, that opportunity, and not just in elections, but on so many topics, to go below the surface and actually find that there's a lot of common ground, regardless of one's position on a certain issue. If you come from a place of compassion and the willingness to listen, you can find at the base a lot of common motivation, interest, safe communities, good schools, things like that actually, no matter how you vote in November, you want these things. So I love that answer from about how you approach people when you're having these conversations about election administration, and your encouragement for people to really understand the process by getting into the process, by participating in it. I love it. Hey, Ben, this has been awesome. One piece of advice for anybody rising up into a leadership position, what would you say to them?
Well, as the title says, you gotta expect the unexpected. But when I think about how I deal with that in this role or in elections, having sort of a North Star, having a sense, for me, that is good governance and customer service. When I think about what we're doing here, to me, I come back to that. So, something comes up, that's unexpected, or you hit rough waters or whatever it is, or we've got challenging decisions, sort of having that North Star focal point and saying, okay, how does this line up, gives me the confidence that the decision I'm making, if it's in furtherance of that goal, is going to be a good one, or at least one that I can very easily sleep at night. It might not always be right, but I know that I was trying to further that goal, that I was trying to serve people better, that I was trying to help Americans participate in the process. And again, if that's, if that was your intention, more times than not, it's going to work out right. And those times that it doesn't, at least you were trying to do the right thing.
That's a perfect answer. Navigating rough waters, have your North Star. Have your North Star. That's awesome. Love it. Hey, Ben, this has been awesome. I know our listeners are going to really appreciate this episode. Thanks for taking the time. And next time I'm in your area in DC, hopefully we can grab coffee.
That'd be great. And yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
This episode of As Unexpected is sponsored in part by Semester at Sea, a study abroad program where students visit 10 countries on 3 continents, all while taking 3 to 4 college classes through Colorado State University. See course offerings and upcoming voyage itineraries at www.semesteratsea.org.